Do 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 do. Hey, how's it going? It's Nancy Gamon. Would you like to create beautiful implied landscapes while you sleep? In this video, I'll show you how to do exactly that using melting ice and powdered dye. The supply list for this project is a little bit long, so I'll put all the details in the video description. But I'm starting with a 100% cotton piece of fabric here. My piece is about 30 inches by 20 inches. And I also have a photograph that I'm using as a reference, which is just a calendar page of a pretty simple landscape. And what I'm going to do to begin with here is just kind of crumple up my fabric into a pattern that will yield a sort of organic design. And what I like to do is kind of crumple it long ways first a little bit, and then crumple it short ways until it makes sort of a little bit of a square. And this, where it's kind of puckered and folded, it will create kind of organic shapes and waves. And the dye setup that I like to use is to start with a plastic bin or pan, which you can see is well used, and then I put on a drying rack or a cooling rack like what you'd use when you bake cookies, and then I top that with a baking pan that has holes punched into it, and then I put some papers on top of that, and these are mat board scraps that my friend Amy Bryce gave me, and I love how these work for this setup. So it's preventing the holes from creating a pattern on the fabric, but the paper will also dye and we'll get some neat results on the mat board. And so then I'm just going to place my crumpled fabric on the mat board, and I'm going to cover it with a damp scrap of cloth, and this will protect my fabric from any loose powdered dye sprinkles, and also kind of let me see where the ice cubes are. So what happens in this setup then is I'm going to cover this with a layer of ice and then sprinkle a powdered dye on top. And so the dye is going to melt down through this protective cloth. It's going to color the fabric underneath, melt through that, color the paper that's underneath that, and then drip down through the holes in the bottom and collect into the plastic bin. So now I'm going to cover the fabric with ice. I've got a bag just of ice cubes off to the side here. And I'm aiming to put on just enough ice to cover it. If there's not enough ice, it will be kind of spotty and weird, but if there's too much, then the color kind of gets diluted. I'm just going to put on a few more cubes, I think. Okay. So I'm going to set this aside here for a second and just take a look again at this picture that I'm referencing. So I spent some time studying this and thinking about what colors I was seeing. There's kind of a light blue and then a darker blue and sort of a brown and spruce color. Then for the field of flowers, it's pretty solid yellow up at the top. But then there gets more and more green introduced as you get lower into the picture. And so I picked out dye colors that reflected what I was seeing, and now I'm going to sprinkle them on using this as a guide. So I'm going to scoot this back over here. I'm going to start with the sky and work my way down. So I'm going to start with a really light blue called Wedgwood blue. It actually has a tiny bit of purple in it, and I'm just going to sprinkle that across the top. And then I'm going to scoot this over a tiny bit. Hopefully you can see the picture and the project at the same time. Then I'm going to sprinkle on a little darker blue underneath that. And you should be wearing a dust mask, by the way. I actually am not doing that right now so that you can understand me. And then for the tree line, I'm going to use a brownish color called bracken. And sprinkle on my trees here. These will be kind of the tree branches, I guess. And then I'm going to use a color called Kingfisher Blue, which is kind of a sprucey color. And that will create the little bit of green that I'm also seeing in there. Then I picked out 3 different colors of yellow to use just to kind of create some variation in the bottom area, and also because I didn't quite have the exact color I was looking for. So I'm going to start with lemon yellow and put a lot of that at the top where it seems brightest. Get that on pretty well. And then I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit over the rest of it to kind of take the color down and tie it in. Then I also have something called deep yellow, which really leans towards the orange, so I'm not going to use a whole lot of it, and I'm going to put it a little bit down further towards the bottom. And then I have something fun called Melted Peep, and I'm just going to sprinkle that like the dickens everywhere. And hopefully this will give us a nice yellow flowery garden there at the bottom. Then for the green, I'm using a combination of avocado, which is a little bit of a darker green, and I'm going to put that again mostly at the bottom where it's sort of darker and where you see most of the green, and just bring a tiny bit of it up into the other flowers. And then lastly, I'm going to use chartreuse green, which is a little bit lighter and brighter. And I'm going to remember that I want to keep a little strip just of solid yellow at the top, but then I'm going to add a little chartreuse under that and then more down at the bottom. So that completes the sprinkling on of the dye. And now the project is ready to sit overnight. All right, here's the completed project. It has rested overnight and all the ice has melted. You can see that there's clumps of powdered dye still on this protective fabric, so I'm glad that I put that into place. We'll just lift this aside here and see what we've got. So here's our dyed fabric. I'm going to lift that out and you can see the yummy dyed papers that developed underneath. So I'm going to set this aside here and spread out our fabric so we can take a look at what we've got. It's quite a bit darker than what it will be once I rinse it out, since it's still all wet here. And just for reference, here's the picture that I was working off of. So what I'm going to do now is take this to the sink. I'm going to rinse it in cold water until the water runs clear. So I'm going to get as much of the dye out that way as I can. Then I'm going to wash the fabric in hot water with a special kind of textile detergent that's designed to really loosen up any remaining dye that's in the fabric and get that out. And then I'm going to rinse it in cold water with a product called Retain, which will set the fabric thin and it will be color fast. If you'd like step-by-step instructions on this whole process, please watch my video called How to Make Kaleidoscope Dyes. I'll put a link to that video at the end of this one so that you can reach it easily. But I'm going to go ahead and do that behind the scenes and get back with you. Here's the completed fabric. It's been rinsed, washed, set, dried, and pressed with a very hot iron. Each side of the fabric is different. There's not necessarily a right or wrong side, but you might have a preference. I actually like the fabric upside down. To me, this looks very watery down here, and it kind of reminds me of a reflection maybe of lily pads on a pond. So I'd be most inclined to work with the fabric in this orientation and maybe go in with some machine stitching or hand stitching and create a little bit more defined suggestion of lily pads on the water. So this is kind of an example of being open to surprise, I guess, in the process of ice dyeing. You can use a photograph to start with, but you might end up with something a little different that's not what you expected, but still lovely. Hey, listen, if you like the idea of ice-dyed landscapes, but you think it'd be more fun to do together, I think you're right. Head on over to my website at nancygamon.com where you can check out the current list of workshops.